One more day until the storm. At the barricades of freedom, when our ranks begin to form, will you take your place with me? So cries Enjolras, a dedicated revolutionary character in the musical adaptation of Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. Louis XVI was in a tight spot, backed into having to make a choice between the nobility and the Third Estate. Time was running out, the country was at a boiling point, and as Enjolras mentioned, a storm was coming. As we barrel into, well, a revolution, let's consider these questions. What events directly led to the French Revolution? What happened during the early phase of the French Revolution? And what were the immediate after effects of this change in France? A big picture question for you to think about: how do the causes of conflict affect later events? Let's track this series of events from where we left off to, well, a famous historical uprising. As we travel, use the timeline on your lesson guide to fill in information on the events that we'll highlight. France was in real economic trouble. Banks weren't lending, prices on everything were soaring, and the king's idea to raise taxes on the nobility not only didn't work, but it spurred the nobles to force him to call the Estates General. But wait, there's more. Members of the Third Estate, you'll recall that everyone who wasn't clergy or nobility wanted to change the rules. The Estates General gave one vote to each estate, thus the third was always outvoted by the first and second. The members of the Third Estate knew that they represented 97% of the country and called on Louis to change the rules from estates voting to individual voting. Predictably, Louis sided with what he knew and refused the call of the Third Estate. In the past, the underclass of France would have shrugged their shoulders, gone home, and grumbled about being treated unfairly, but not this time. The Third Estate stated that they didn't need the other two. They declared themselves separate and walked out. What is the Third Estate? This was the key question and a title of a pamphlet written by Emmanuel Joseph Silla, a clergyman sympathetic to the French underclass. The pamphlet espoused the belief that the Third Estate was a complete nation within itself and didn't need the other two estates. In many ways, Silla was correct, and his pamphlet became the Third Estate's manifesto. They would never receive actual representation in the Estates General, but they didn't need to. They were, in many ways, France itself, and they would make their own decisions. Thus, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and pledged to enact reforms on behalf of the people. This did not go over well with the king. When the National Assembly showed up to their meeting place, they were barred from entering by Louis's soldiers. Fearing attack, the assembly moved to a nearby tennis court, and there 576 people swore an oath not to separate and to reassemble wherever necessary until the constitution of the kingdom is established. This tennis court oath was a declaration of independence from the monarchy and the Ancien regime, and an act of revolution. Feeling the wind shift, some members of the clergy and the nobility joined the National Assembly and began to call for reform. The revolution was on. Before we move on, take a moment to add notes to your timeline of events leading to the French Revolution. A reasonable person would have seen the precarious nature of events and acted with moderation. Louis XVI fled to Versailles and surrounded the palace with mercenaries, or paid fighters, from Switzerland. Yeah. Between the locking of the Third Estate building, the flight to Versailles, and the mercenaries, and the fact that Louis had brought 23 regiments of royal troops to Paris, the people of France began asking, what is the king planning to do next? A rumor had spread that Louis would soon launch a military offensive against his own subjects and disband the National Assembly through force. The stakes had been raised, and the common people had to look to their own defenses. In Paris, a huge mob advanced on the Bastille, a medieval fortress, stronghold of the French monarchy, and a place where prisoners were kept. The mob, looking for arms and gunpowder, ended up seizing the whole fortress and killing several of the guards there. While the heads of the Bastille guards were paraded on pikes throughout the streets, people celebrated, and the storming of the Bastille became a flashpoint for revolution, which began to spread from Paris across the country. Louis had little choice but to attack his own people or come to an agreement. He relented, sent most of the troops back to their posts throughout the country, and returned to Paris on July 17th. He was welcomed by cheering of crowds in the streets. While it seemed the revolution was successful, order quickly broke down. Among arguments over what to do first, the National Assembly had no real plan forward, and order had not been restored in Paris or elsewhere. Rural areas were slower to receive news about the Bastille and National Assembly, but quick to breed rumors. Those rumors whispered an old tale that nobles intentionally held food supplies back so that they could starve the peasants into submission. Called the famine plot, it was compounded by the rumor that troops sent by the French aristocracy would soon attack. This was called the Great Fear. Whether acting in defense or just taking advantage of the situation, mobs of peasants and some of the more well-to-do armed themselves. They stormed noble manor houses and church land across the country to steal, loot, and burn the documents that held them to the nobles' land. Many people died in the widespread violence. Among the dead were clergy and nobility, and the Great Fear passed to these men who were already a part of the National Assembly. They called a meeting and declared that all men should be free and equal. Let's pause here. First, add notes to your timeline of events leading to the French Revolution. Second, what do you think motivated members of the First and Second Estates to side with the National Assembly? Speculate using evidence in your lesson guide. As you may have guessed, most of the clergy and nobility acted out of fear when siding with the National Assembly. But the hysteria throughout the whole country meant that fear wasn't unreasonable. In fact, knowing that something needed to be done, the National Assembly passed the August Decrees, 18 statements declaring the intent of the Assembly and goals of the country going forward. The most impactful of these declared the feudal system to be abolished, taxes to be paid by all people, and for all church finances to now be run through the people of France. In conjunction with these new statements of purpose, the National Assembly now needed a founding document. Enter the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Written by the Marquis de Lafayette with significant input from his good friend Thomas Jefferson, who was the ambassador to France from the new United States at the time, the Declaration was a manifesto of Enlightenment thought. It expressed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and it further clarified those rights: liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It guaranteed equal justice, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion for, well, almost all. The document notoriously excluded, you guessed it, women. How'd that go over? Well, you won't have to wait long to find out, but first, let's recap. For the final time, add notes to your timeline of events for the French Revolution. Next, look over your timeline and speculate on what's next for France. If you thought that the king was pretty silent about a group of peasants basically declaring themselves a republic, you'd be correct. Publicly, Louis stated that he was happy with the noble and generous démarche of the first two orders of the state, who made great sacrifices for the general reconciliation, for their patrie, and for their king. Privately, Louis stated, "Sacrifices were fine. I cannot admire it. I will never consent to the despoliation of my clergy and my nobility. I will never give my sanction to the decrees that despoil them." And while the Declaration and the August decrees seemed to point the country into a positive direction, the economic problems which had begun the whole crisis had worsened. Which leads us to the last major event on your timeline for now. Throughout that chilly morning in October, about 100 women, upset about their lack of inclusion in the Declaration and the high price of bread, started a riot. They gathered what weapons they could and started marching to Versailles, which is where Louis had again retreated to. On the way, thousands of others joined the march. Versailles was overwhelmed, and the next day the king, his family, and most of the National Assembly were forced to meet in Paris, where the women demanded equal rights, which was ultimately rejected. Where do we leave our story? Well, the king and his family were now held by the crowd and kept in Paris along with many others in the nobility and the National Assembly. Other members of the clergy and nobility had begun to flee France. The economic crisis and who qualifies for equal rights were still front and center, and a relatively little-known lawyer by the name of Maximilien Robespierre was defending the actions of the rioters to the rest of the country. Where do we go next? Well, forward, of course, because history is everywhere.